A fascinating and unexpected deep dive, yes, pun intended, into the world of sea urchin ranching. Yes, those spiky things you see sometimes when you're diving or snorkeling. High-end fish restaurants which have their sea urchins flown in from Japan, and a warm water blob that caused the sea urchins to overgraze the kelp forest in the last 10 to 15 years on the west coast in the US, leading to an explosion of sea urchins and an implosion of the kelp forest, and many, many hundreds of millions of zombie sea urchins that are preventing the kelp forest to regrow, but without dying themselves. But why should we care? Because this is happening everywhere. An invasive species or extreme weather event triggers an ecosystem collapse, and without smart intervention, it won't recover. What is a smart intervention in this case? Harvest the sea urchins that are threatening the surviving kelp forest, fatten the urchins, and sell them into the growing market of higher-end seafood. What can we learn from here and apply in other ecosystems out of balance? Which are pretty much any ecosystem. Take a deep breath. And another one. Every second breath we take comes from the oceans, and over half of the fish we eat is farmed. That's why we dedicate a series to explore the potential of regeneration underwater. Oceans and other water bodies cover most of our planet and have stored most of the excess heat so far, and at the same time have some of the best opportunities to produce healthy food, mostly protein, store carbon, create materials, fuel, biostimulants, and much, much more. Plus, create a lot of jobs in coastal communities. We have largely ignored the water-based farming, aquaculture, industry in this podcast until now. In these conversations, we explore why aquaculture is so important for the future of our planet. If we get this wrong, we have a serious problem. And what are the risks and challenges with feed, the reliance on soy, pests, yes, there are pests underwater, antibiotics, microplastics, etc. What does it mean when you apply regenerative principles to aquaculture? What can soil-based agriculture learn from aquaculture and vice versa? And what should investors really know about water-based farming and what the potential is of regenerative aquaculture? A series of interviews with the people putting money to work, entrepreneurs and investors in this crucial and often overlooked sector. We're grateful for the support of the Nest Family Office in order to make this series. The Nest is a family office dedicated to building a more resilient food system through supporting natural solutions and innovative technologies that change the way we produce food. You can find out more on the Nest FO, that is thenestfo.com, or in the links below. Welcome to another episode. Today with the founder of OoNee, Sustainable Sea Urchin Ranching, Regenerating Oregon's Kelp Forest. That's not a sentence I thought I would ever say, sea urchins and ranching in the same sentence. We're going to unpack a lot of that, but welcome Aaron to the show.
Thank you very much, Cohen. Good to be here.
And to start with a personal question we always love to ask at the beginning, obviously, instead of like, oh, introduce yourself, but more, how did it happen that you spent most of your awake hours thinking about sea urchins? And yes, those are the spiky things you find in some places where you go diving or snorkeling. And more specifically about the zombie version of them. They are alive, but not really, and they're not really dead. And they're actually quite a threat to kelp forests. So what happened that led you down this career path that I can't imagine there are many people thinking about sea urchins all the time?
I mean, why wouldn't you want to think about it? They're so cool.
I mean, of course, but
for
those 3 or 4 people that are not that are listening and thinking, of course, I don't think every second about that. What happened?
Yeah, for those people that are not obsessed over sea urchins on a daily basis, there's almost a confluence of interesting aspects here. I mean, I've been studying kelp regeneration and kelp forests for 10 years already. And this really kind of came about because I was actually interested in sort of the principles of permaculture applied to the ocean when I was living in California. And this kelp forest degradation, this zombie urchin issue has actually been percolating on the West Coast and across the Pacific and actually Atlantic for a number of years, actually over a decade now. And I'd always been thinking in the back of my mind, what can we actually do about this? There are definitely a lot of kelp hatcheries getting started. There's kelp farming, there's kelp restoration. When I stumbled upon an urchin diver in Oregon a little over a year and a half ago, a gentleman by the name of Brad Bailey, we actually started talking more about urchin ranching as a way to restore kelp forests. And, you know, my obsession with sea urchins is not just the fact that I think it's a species that I think is commercially harvestable, but it happens to be one of my favorite foods. I've grown up with eating a lot of umami flavored things. Sea urchin, if no one's ever tasted it before, especially purple sea urchin, I would urge everyone to go out and actually try it. Once you fall in love with something, you tend to have a very visceral response and emotional connection with it.
So what does it taste like? Because I actually haven't tasted one, or I don't remember.
I need to send you a sample. And I would say this, if you've had it at a sushi restaurant, you may get a similar, as close of a possible taste to pulling it out of the reef and cracking it open. But when you first taste it, it is a combination of the sweetness of the kelp, the wild kelp it's been feeding on, the saltiness of the ocean, this brininess that sort of balances out the sweetness and the saltiness. And it has a consistency, people say, of custard. But when you really sort of put it on top of just seaweed and rice, it's probably the best thing personally that I've ever tasted in my life. So.
Okay, so this is a good primer into this one. Okay, so if you happen to go to a restaurant tonight, or if you're a good seafood restaurant, go, and you have never tried it, definitely try it and let us know.
Yeah.
But what's the issue? I mean, you mentioned they are feeding on the kelp forest. What's the issue with sea urchins, and why are you focusing not only, let's say, your restaurant time on it and your cooking time on it, but also your working time?
Yeah, I mean, this is really no fault of the sea urchin. I mean, most animals and plants in the world, they really sort of go about their own programming. When you look at sort of how the species interact in an ecosystem, when the ecosystem itself becomes out of balance, things become out of balance. And what happened over 10 years ago was there's this blob of warm water in the Pacific. It's called the warm blob for obvious reasons. They thought it would basically persist for a few months. It persisted for over a year. In that time, those sea urchins' predators, which were these sunflower sea stars, that existed by the billions along the west coast of the US, they basically melted away. And so when you have a sort of a keystone predator that's gone, the sea urchins keep doing what they're doing. And they basically went about and started eating more and more of the kelp forest without any predators to keep them in check. Fast forward 10, 15 years, there have been some nascent efforts to send divers out with hammers to crush them. But as you and I were talking about, Cohen, when you have a hammer, you can only crush maybe 100 or so each time. You're literally looking now at an ecosystem that spans hectares and hectares of hundreds of millions of sea urchins, basically sitting in a destroyed, decimated kelp forest, and they're basically starved out. That exists along the west coast of the US, that exists along the coast of Australia, it exists along the coast of Japan, it exists all over the world, South Africa. And essentially these urchins, having been survivors in the past millennia, have found ways to survive without it actually eating. They simply turn themselves off for a few years. And when the kelp regrows and they smell it, they'll basically reanimate themselves and they'll go back and they'll eat that little budding piece of kelp. So without removing the urchins from the kelp forests or the urchin barrens, the kelp does not have a likelihood and a high probability of growing back because there are just too many urchins out there right now.
So what has happened basically was this weird climate event that will happen more often is of warmer
Absolutely.
water for a long period of time. Their natural predator, the sea stars, were boiled, and the sea urchins are natural survivors. They didn't. And they just started eating and eating and eating until they consumed basically their whole kelp forest. But instead of dying out, and we've maybe seen that in other ecosystems like land systems where you see, I don't know, tree stumps being eaten by deers, etc. At some point the deer dies if there's no tree stumps or there's nothing left to eat. Sea urchins have something special in the sense they can survive in an off mode for years, slowly the kelp forest starts regrowing or is replanted or somehow starts to reflourish. And before it even can start to get to a healthy balance, it of course gets eaten immediately again by in this case, I think I read somewhere 300 million sea urchins. So there's zombies there basically waiting for a little piece of kelp, which of course gets eaten in a second. And so we have to remove them. How do you go about, like, what, even if you start reading these reports, you start seeing this, you think of I don't know, you start dreaming of a zombie army of 300 million sea urchins. How do you even start thinking about removing them? I understand people are doing the kelp side of things, but of course that doesn't really help if you have sea urchins waiting around there to get their snack. And I see the smashing videos. I mean, it's interesting to see. It's probably really good meditation. I've seen divers with hammers, but yeah, that's hardly scalable.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those cases where I do think you need a commercial approach. Again, I might be sort of subjectively biased on this, but someone once asked me, well, what happens when you pull all the urchins out of the water? You're out of business. And I told them, if you do the math, you will make a very small dent, even at a few 100,000 pounds a year in the grand scheme of things, to pull, even a third of that from the reef in Oregon. And by the way, that 300 million sort of number that you quoted is just off of reef in Oregon. And so when you look worldwide, you'll never really make a massive dent writ large at the entire ecosystem. I think the focus from a commercial perspective is you have to still focus on the areas, the liminal edges, where the kelp forest and these urchin barrens are kind of colliding. And you want to protect the areas that are still protectable. And then you kind of want to move out in concentric circles year over year to sort of push things out.
So you don't want to go to like the desert of kelp. You want to
you don't want to start farming harvesting in a desert. Exactly. There's never a good idea to harvest in a desert for obvious reasons. Number one, when they do become a zombie urchin, reanimating them actually takes a lot more work than pulling one that's kind of on the precipice, if you will, of zombifying themselves.
Depends, of course, what you want to do with them, because you're not smashing them. You came up with the approach, let's take them out, in this case, the ones that are on the verge of being a zombie, and actually ranch them, grow them, and then sell them into the sea urchins market. As we started this, they taste amazing.
Yeah, I would also caution people from smashing, just going out into the wild and smashing urchins. If it happens to be urchins that actually are full of roe, smashing an urchin will actually release more eggs and sperm into the water, because urchins have this death rattle. And when they are threatened or on the precipice of extinguishing their lives, they will actually spawn in the water. And so there are certain studies that say, you really want to focus also on where you want to smash if you are going to go out there and smash. But I think this is also where having a sort of a semblance in a sense of sort of what the ocean and the ecology is telling you is going to be the wisest approach to the problem.
So you're saying, okay, the solution might be eating them, but of course you don't want to eat a semi-zombie one because they're very thin. How do you even get that into a form or an idea of a company?
So there have been budding research across the world, usually within the dregs of a PhD thesis, around various attempts to ranch urchins. Norway actually has done a good amount of research into animal feeds. There's been a few companies in South Africa that are trying to broaden their abalone portfolios and branch off into urchins, because they're both detritus feeders, and they may consume similar types of feeds. I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that the people that understand seafood are rightfully seeing that commercial harvests of wild urchin have basically been precipitously falling for the last 15, 20 years. In fact, in Oregon, there used to be armies, in California as well, armies of basically divers whose livelihoods would be to jump in the water, pull those urchins out, meet a buyer, most likely from Japan, And that Japanese buyer would basically send those wild urchins over to Japan for consumption. The challenge has been, obviously, that now with the kelp forest being decimated, the wild harvest has dropped precipitously. And so the whole notion of ranching an urchin didn't necessarily start from the fact that there was a kelp forest crisis. It literally started from the fact that there was necessity,
demand,
because the supply was dropping. And, you know, if you've sort of seen the proliferation of sushi restaurants, especially during COVID, people are actually eating more and more sushi. And so what you have is basically this supply constraint and this you know, hyperbolically or hyper increase, if you will, in sushi demand across Western countries.
And how difficult is it? I mean, you're finding out now to ranch sea urchins. Like, has that been done before? Like for the food side of things, or the feed? Like, how difficult is it to take these semi-zombies out of the water? I mean, apart from that, you shouldn't get stung, but like, and then what? Like, what do you do? How do you feed them? Is this like domesticating sea urchins? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, you got to train them. So they'll respond to a few commands. And so you pull them out of the water. And what people have traditionally done is they've dove for them. I mean, this is a traditional harvest. If you go all the way back to what, you know, Native Americans and indigenous folks did, they harvested this way. They dove for them. Nowadays, you harvest with an air hose, and you'll pull them out of the reef. You actually need something quite hardy to pull them out of the reef. It looks like a crowbar. It looks like a fork. Various divers have various implements, but you're in the water and you're pulling them out. And when you pull them out, you put them into a basket. Basket floats up to the top of the water, and we pull it into the boat, and then we take it back to shore and we transplant it into a warehouse. Now, what do we have in the warehouse? As I was mentioning to you earlier, we had actually been doing a lot of research on ways to build raceway systems. A lot of this research can be borrowed from existing aquaculture research and existing aquaculture proof of concepts, adapted to the specific biological traits of an urchin. But we've built raceway systems that essentially will hold an urchin, will allow them to feed, and also will allow their waste to be consumed by other species. In this case, specifically talking about the West Coast and the Pacific Northwest at large, there are Red Sea cucumbers that will actually eat the urchin waste, and there's actually kelp that will remediate the effluent, so we can build essentially a truly circulatory recirculating system that is as sustainable as possible.
And what do the urchins eat? I mean, they eat kelp normally. Do they eat then the kelp that you grow? Like, how do you feed these new semi-wild?
We're growing Pacific dulse in a tank. That's for trial purposes. We're actually also sourcing some really interesting third-generation urchin pellets that the Nature Conservancy down in California has actually been iterating on. So they have researchers down in California that have been actually testing out urchin feeds based off the fact that the urchin barren problem has been persisting for over a decade in California as well. So we partner with them pretty closely, and we are testing out pellets. Obviously, at the commercial scale, you want to use pellets. You can control the actual formula of pellets. And with an open source feed like the one that the Nature Conservancy has, you can bring the formula to an industrial presser, and you can basically commercially produce those pellets as well.
And then where do you sell? I mean, where do you gonna sell? Where do you sell already? How easy then is the market? Is that relatively straightforward because a lot of the wild demand or a lot of the wild supply has disappeared?
Yeah.
Or how easy is gonna be the selling part?
I mean, I think the Pacific Northwest is a really good test bed for this because the ecology in Oregon just happens to produce some of the best tasting urchins in the world. We have cold upwelling of nutrient-dense waters. Again, as I mentioned, we still have some relatively intact kelp forests. And so the animals that you bring on shore, onto land and ranch, actually tastes really wonderful. And you just happen to be also close to what I would say was the third largest market for sushi in the world, which is actually the west coast of the US. You could also imagine us sending urchins to Japan. But I think from a supply chain perspective and from a, just being a little bit less carbon intensive, the west coast of the U.S.
Because they have to be flown, of course.
Yeah. They have to be flown, obviously on a cargo plane, obviously overnight. But on the west coast, you're looking at Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, L.A., San Diego, Santa Barbara. In the middle of the country, you actually have Dallas and Houston and Chicago, places you don't think people would actually eat urchin, but actually are starting to have a really high demand for it. And then obviously on the East Coast. So the U.S. actually is a market that I believe is actually very ready for sustainable urchin.
And then, like, how long does it take? You take the semi-zombies, let's say, out of the water. You start feeding them a bit of the pellet. Like, how long are you ranching them for? How long do you have to? Of course, depending on their state of starvation. But
yeah, so it's interesting. You actually do want to start them out. We found that if there's any amount of existing OoNee inside the urchin, that the flavor and the color profile will persist all the way through the fattening cycle. And so in an ideal state, you actually do want these zombie urchins. You want as close to a zombie urchin without being a zombie, if you will. But then from then, it takes about 8 to 10 weeks to fatten them up to an index. We use this term called gonadal index. It sounds kind of weird because, yes, the term gonad is in there, but it's basically the percentage of OoNee inside of an urchin. And around 15% is when you harvest them. Anything over 15%, they actually start getting kind of soft and really hard to open the urchin and sort of shuck out that lobe, if you will. And so we really try to make sure that we harvest them and fatten them within a 10-week cycle at about a 15% gonadal index.
And we're learning so much about sea urchins. If you're not a fish person, this is not your episode, but still fascinating. And then, like, how's been the response from the market so far? Like, restaurants you've tested with, you worked with, like, you showed some, like, what's the, because this is different, obviously, than any kind of other urchins they normally would source, but maybe they didn't source so much anymore because of the crisis. Like, what has been the response from that side?
I think a few things. I think our approach has really been to keep it as organic as possible. And as much as we can in these early stages, we will. What that means is that when we pull the urchin out of the water, it's either on someone's plate or it's shucked and on someone's plate in a matter of days. That means that the quality and the taste of the urchin is probably the most pure that you can get out in market. When you traditionally eat one at a sushi restaurant, it's been flown from Japan. They may claim it's high end, which it may be. But if it's been sitting in a cargo plane and then it's been sitting in a warehouse for a few days, it's also been sitting in a preservative. And when you get that OoNee, it may taste really, really good. But once they've tasted one of our urchins, there's just really no comparison. And
so why do you do that so fast then? Like, in terms of out of the water into, because they're ready, they're fat already, or because you don't need to fatten them, or that process isn't being developed?
When they're harvested and then fattened, yes, correct. But I would say that it's really important in these early stages to basically make people fall in love with the story. And the best way to make people fall in love with the story is to have the product that tastes the best out in the market.
Flavor.
And flavor. And Pacific Northwest, California at large, there are a lot of chefs that have been searching for these ingredients and have a mission of serving local and sustainable foods. And when they do have something like OoNee that is not from Mexico or Japan or Chile, and they can actually claim and say that it's local, you can see their eyes light up. And similarly, there are increasing number of wholesale distributors that also want to align around that mission. And so I don't think it's a hard thing to sort of get people bought into our mission. I think it's actually the challenge that we will have is making sure that our stuff tastes better than everyone else's out there.
And why do you think it's a challenge? Because of the ranging piece,
Yeah.
or like how do you see that?
Well, our urchins are unlike maybe a kampachi or a salmon. Not that you want to have frozen salmon, but you can freeze fish. You can even freeze oysters. I've seen oysters frozen. You can freeze clams. You cannot freeze sea urchin. And so the ability for you to basically get it from your ranch to a table is predicated on how quickly you can get it there.
Yeah.
Because its shelf life is actually a lot lower than other foods. But therein lies also why it's just so darn expensive.
Because the cost, people will, like compared to Japan, like your cost, of course, different now, beginning, startup, etc. But like your cost thinking, how is that compared to flown in?
I think you could use a baseline. I mean, there are comparables out in the market. Right now, you're seeing 100-gram trays sell for about $60. 200-gram trays will sell for anywhere from $100 to $150 for 200 grams. And so, you know, when you scale the model, as all aquaculture and even agriculture commodities need to be in order to sort of find their cash flow break-even points and their gross margins, there is a model that makes sense here based off of the fact that those price points, you know, will support this type of regenerative model at scale.
Yeah, it's probably one of the more expensive things you find on the plate anywhere without going to caviar and things like that, which
absolutely
potentially means it can drive a lot of regeneration.
I mean, that's the hope. You want to get to commercial scale because the more commercial scale you can meet, the more of your impact goals you can meet as well. So,
and we discussed this in the pre-chat we had as well. Like how many, like how soon do you have an impact on that kelp forest? Like you're removing them just where the kelp forest is like under threat. Like how many square meters or square kilometers? Like how big do we need to think in terms of sea urchins? How many do you need to move when you can say, okay, we're starting to have an impact on this piece of ocean?
I would say this: the research is still ongoing. We do know that focusing on a kelp forest on the precipice is much more productive from an impact and protection standpoint than obviously focusing on an urchin barren. We do know that the ratio of urchins to square meter of kelp, if you will, the sort of healthy ratio is about 1 urchin per square meter. And so there are certainly measurements that we use and that partners like Reef Check use on the West Coast when they're doing their scientific monitoring every single year to determine sort of how healthy or not healthy certain areas of the ecosystem are. I think one thing that needs to happen more of is basically bringing more real-time monitoring into the kelp forest so we can sort of see the correlation. But there are certain ratios we're working off of and certain areas of the kelp forest we know where we can make the biggest impact right now. And just so you know, in the Oregon Reef, we are attempting to protect about 50 hectares currently under our sort of subscale harvest model.
Wow! And how many grams or kilos or tons of urchins are you, or how many urchins are you talking about? Just to give a sense of scale. We're now in end of summer, Northern Hemisphere 2024. Well, what are your numbers or your figures looking like?
Yeah, I mean, for this year, we'd like to produce about 100,000 pounds of gross weight urchins. And with additional funding and ability to build out a small scale facility, I mean, you can be talking about in the millions of pounds. But even in that 50 hectare region we're trying to protect, if you will, there's hundreds of thousands of urchins out there. So even harvesting 100,000 pounds this year, we will hopefully at least protect that area. But there will still be plenty of urchins even in that 50-hectare area.
Wow, yeah, it's just the sense of scale is just crazy.
And I can also send you a video, by the way, of one of our dives, so you can get a sense for sort of how dense the urchins are clustered in the reef. It's really crazy to think about if you had ever, gone diving or watched underwater documentaries with David Attenborough when you were little, to see that sort of juxtaposed against sort of what the current reality looks like. It's quite it's quite visceral when you actually see it with your own eyes. So
in 15 years, and that's nothing basically.
Yeah.
And so how does it make you feel then, like how is your longer term vision on impact? Like how does this impact more reefs, even though it seems like an impossible task to harvest so many urchins that are potentially needed? Like how does that, as an entrepreneur, but of course the impact side as well, how does it make you feel about, of course, eating urchins, but how do you impact more than that? Or what's your vision there to impact the reefs at scale?
Yeah, I mean, there's a partnership model I think we are going to have to forge. There have been organizations that have forged in the past that I've studied, but it really has to be a partnership approach where everyone's incentives are aligned. And the divers that have been doing this for decades in their current livelihood, just like any commercial fisherman right now you talk to, they're struggling. And every single year it gets worse and worse. And you really also want to think about a model that makes them whole. Without them being made whole, this enterprise doesn't work. And so I think you have to think about a systems design that includes not just the ranching technology, but also the economic incentives that bring them along. And I think this has been done in various iterations, not to perfect effect, because there are still definitely some political considerations around, what urchin divers want, what researchers and regulators want, what communities want. But I think there has to be a few things. The urchin divers obviously have to be brought along the journey. The longer term thesis, I believe, for ranching in general and sustainable aquaculture is that some of these systems have to be able to be decoupled from the ocean and brought closer to urban centers, where the vast majority of commodities and seafood is actually consumed, closer to where the markets are. And so there is a lot of research and discussions around how to actually build a recirculating system that can truly be decoupled and moved closer to major urban centers like Los Angeles, Seattle, New York, whatnot.
And what would that mean in this case? That you wouldn't be harvesting urchins from the sea anymore, or that you would grow them basically from egg? I don't know how that works in urchins, but
you still want to harvest them because you need to get them out of the reef. But instead of ranching them close to the coast, you would basically move them into a large warehouse. And that obviously obviates the needs for one major thing, which has been a huge hindrance for aquaculture at large in a lot of Western countries, which is your ability to basically secure not only permits, but also secure sites that sometimes compete with wealthy landowners and people that want an unobstructed view of the ocean from their waterfront home. When you sort of think about aquaculture today, you think about Vietnam, you think about, Philippines, Asia, Norway. But in order, I think, for it to really sort of take off in what I would sort of say Western, wealthier countries, you do have to acknowledge that there is a land use issue that has to be resolved. And there are definitely companies that are already starting to set up land-based systems that are, decoupled from the coast and moved inshore into warehouses.
Yeah, and then the question is, where does your water come from, or your seawater? You cannot have a flow-through or hybrid system, but
you would pull the water in from basically the municipal tap, but you would add your own salts. That part actually is not necessary, and you would obviously dechlorinate. That part in itself is actually not not a huge challenge, if you will. It's actually really just getting the whole recirculating system down from a waste removal perspective.
Which doesn't seem to be such an issue in the sea urchin side of things.
No, I mean, you can have biofilters. You can have good filtration, just like you would if you went to like your city aquarium. They have really good biofilters. In our case, actually, like I mentioned earlier, we're using kelp and actually sea cucumbers to sort of fully utilize the natural stacking functions of these species. But you could arguably use different system designs to resolve the waste issue.
So, what do you see as the biggest barrier now for this and the challenge to take off on specifically on the sea urchin side?
I think one of the things around aquaculture, agriculture in general, is kind of what I would call the Capex Valley of Death, if you will. When you think about the capital markets, you've got debt, you've got equity, some project financing, you've got non-dilutive grants. The mix of all of these, in some format, will make it amenable for ag and aquaculture, but the learning curve is quite steep. And actually trying to figure out how to bridge the Capex gap is something that I think a lot of companies talk about. Some of it comes down to writing the right grant application. I do think with some of the infrastructure investments that the government is making, it's starting to percolate down to these companies. But again, there's not enough funding there. Early stage investing is a huge piece that I think folks like you are focused on, which is just getting more folks that are interested in the space, helping companies through that gap. A lot of it just comes down to figuring out how to self-fund things like the prototype that we've built, to demonstrably show that we can actually knock down one or two risk factors. But I also think for us, especially in aquaculture, the biggest thing that we hear from investors is just the fact that they don't understand biological risk. And that seems to sort of be one of those idiosyncrasies where I would say, if you don't understand it, hire domain experts that do. But make a bet in the space. And if you're one of the first ones to make a bet in the space, you're usually the one that makes a lot more of the money versus the follow-on investors. So I think a lot of this just has to do with a lot of the financing and capital markets folks, wading in more into the space, because the phase shift is happening a lot faster, I think, at least on the ground, than I think a lot of folks actually realize right now.
The disconnect between the shiny glass office, let's say, and the ground itself. Either huge. It's a facility where you grow sea urchins or rent sea urchins, or it's an agroforestry system, or like the disconnect is enormous, and
absolutely,
like, people really don't. And I think it paralyzes as well. Like if you don't understand the risks, or don't even have a mental framework to put the risk somewhere, you probably don't do anything. Like you would click away, oh, this is interesting, and then go to the next.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Do something that fits in your framework, which might be real estate or something maybe way riskier. But it fits in your mental framework, and your friends are also doing it, so you don't lose your job if it goes wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. And again, that's just human nature. That's
so how do we overcome human nature?
I mean, that's the way I've seen capital markets work for my entire career, is that, there's very few of those innovators out there in capital markets, just like there's very few innovators that actually truly want to sort of build something new. We need to find like change agents within the investment community. And I think it's hard, but, the burden is on the entrepreneur to basically prove that the idea makes sense to someone that has a receptive mind. I think, my sort of philosophy has been quickly divide and conquer. Like, don't spend your time on sort of convincing folks that might not necessarily be open to it, but you do have to find the people that are going to be open to it, and then you have to spend the time to educate them. And they do have valid questions, and you have to spend the time to basically answer those questions or figure out ways to ameliorate their concerns. And those are all just conversations we all need to keep having. But as long as there are investors that are open to the space, which I think there are more and more of, I think it's going to keep growing. And I just think we have to kind of ignore the broader investment ecosystem at large, because we can keep complaining about it all day, but we need to focus on the folks that are actually considering investing in the space and continuing to educate them on sort of what it is that we think is an investable thesis for them.
Yeah, I think it's that innovator dilemma of how much time do you want to spend on education versus convincing? You're clearly saying don't convince, but focus on the ones that want to be educated and are interested. Yes. But it's probably they're asking a lot of questions, simple questions. Let's not call them stupid questions. Simple questions that you're like, oh, that we figured it out 5 years ago. But you need them to go on that journey because they need to tell others about that story. Exactly like Dan Miller introduced me to you. And are you interested in sea urchin ranching? And of course, I'm like, why is that important? And then you understand why. And then that, let's say, that's something you must be doing all day. But it's a very fundamental piece of advice, I think, for other innovators that are doing similar things or similar things out there that are so far out there that most people would consider them crazy. But that's exactly the ones that are going to change. Not all of them, obviously, this is not investment advice, but we rely on all of them trying to figure out the things that actually do work and end up being normal, not crazy.
I mean, I think you're right. And I think I've thought about this a lot because you either take a top-down approach, which is what do investors care about? And you build a company within their thesis, so their ecosystem. If you really want to do something grounds up and you've kind of crafted your own narrative, I think the burden is on you to educate people and help them understand why they should broaden their thesis to include you. And obviously there's some overlaps. There are some areas where I think we can sort of shift the mindset and framing where this does fall into like a very investable thesis. But the burden is always on the entrepreneur and the innovator. And I have heard a lot of entrepreneurs say, well, don't waste your time on a lot of these investors. They're just doing their diligence. And I say, well, it depends on what your story is. Really, if you're really sort of just creating a company in a sector that you know is investable, maybe you can take that approach. But if this really is sort of like one of those things that you formulated without that top-down criteria, you're probably going to need to spend some more time educating people on it.
Yeah, I think this is going to resonate with a lot of people. And so it's a natural bridge to a question we like to ask. Let's say we do this in San Francisco or Los Angeles in a theater and the room is full of investors, either their own money or other people's money. What would be the main message? Or if you can give them, if you can plant one seed in their mind, let's say, something they remember the next day, what would that be?
I think it's similar. The best corollary I could probably give them is that just like AI, so AI,
now everybody's listening. Everybody's listening.
I was in San Francisco for many years, and actually AI was around. Now, were these sort of generative models, these like large language models around? Maybe, maybe not, but they're in R&D. And then one day there was a company that did something big. OpenAI released their models quickly, and then everyone basically jumped in. And I would say this, which is the people that jumped in first were the ones that made money. And now you have all these funds that are investing on the edges because they can't get in. And if you understand the phase shift that we're going through right now with agriculture and harvesting wild seafood, we don't even harvest wild animals anymore on land. I mean, the phase shift that needs to happen, well, people say, well, we want it to happen. Well, there's a forcing function here, which is climate change. And I think investors intuitively or viscerally understand this, just like we all do, which is this entire system is going to get re-architected whether you like it or not. And so from an investment perspective, I would say, if you believe in that thesis, do your homework, hire the right experts. You don't have to understand everything. People don't still understand everything about AI. You just need to understand that it's happening, and you just need to basically be one of the first ones to get into the space. That's all I would say.
Place your bets, wisely.
Place your
obviously.
Bets.
Not investment advice, but it's interesting how the phase shift in aquaculture with climate change and in agriculture as well. Like fundamentally, we're in an acceleration of many things that have been happening, and we've been talking about it, how to get fossil fuels out of it, how to, etc., etc. But now suddenly we have to, because massive floods, droughts, etc., massive heat effects that you see, like a blob of warm water for a little over a year can basically turn an ecosystem upside down, and a whole industry of wild harvesting sea urchin people disappears.
Yeah. I mean, we can call them exogenous factors. We can call them biological risks. We can call them whatever. I think the sort of future from an investor's standpoint is that there are going to be many more risks that pop up. And if you are no longer willing to accept exogenous risk, biological risk, any other risk, your investment criteria will become more and more narrow, and you will no longer be able to sort of raise money for your fund because there'll be so many investors crowded in certain spaces that they'll have to return the money back to their LPs. I honestly think if you're going to start a fund today, you should look into the regenerative space, because it is really just there's just so much investment that needs to be made to re-architect this entire system, that there's just a lot more returns to be had here than there is if you're going to invest in the 10th AI startup. There's only room in that ecosystem for a handful of them.
This is like the perfect bridge to the next question. What would happen if you would be in charge of a large fund, let's say $1 billion? Of course, again, we're not giving investment advice and also not looking for dollar amounts, but what would you focus on? Like, what would be big buckets of your attention if you had to put a significant, in this day and age, I think OpenAI is raising for more than 100 billion valuation. Let's see when this airs, and let's see if you listen in a year, if they're still around. It might be fun to look back at it. But anyway, we're in that time of where billions don't seem to matter anymore. But in ag and food, it still matters. Let's say $1 billion. What would you do?
Yeah, and I'm not going to claim that I've ideated this, completely in my own black box, because there are certainly folks out there that are starting to do this. In fact, there are some clusters like Washington Maritime Blue up in Seattle that I'm a part of, Hatch Accelerator. Which,
shout out to Hatch,
you and
George,
I know Carsten and George. But
and
it needs to be scaled up. This concept of ocean clusters, and even agricultural clusters, by the way, is that they all need to be connected so that they can cross-pollinate. This is not something that, you would learn something in the Pacific Northwest that you wouldn't be able to share with someone in Norway. We need to basically create these investment clusters. Ideally, they're centered around university or research organizations, although that does present its own set of challenges. But I think there are a lot of venture studios out there that you could essentially take that model and say, look, we just need to make a bet on experts. We may not necessarily be the experts in everything, but surely we can make a bet on EIRs and create venture studios and basically just germinate a lot of these ideas from seed to Series A to Series B. I think right now, a lot of the funds are saying, well, we're going to invest at the Series A level, or we're going to invest in growth stage. But how do you basically get all these entrepreneurs to actually start these companies? And I think therein lies the challenges. I would put the entire $1 billion into a cluster of venture studios, and I would basically just go about basically bring in the best domain experts and entrepreneurs from each of these sectors to start companies.
And then when you say a cluster, just to make it visual, like what do you mean by a cluster? Is that the Oregon coast around the kelp forest? Like what is a cluster to you?
Yeah, I would center them around areas where obviously there's a good ecosystem, not just environmental and ecological, but researchers. There would be at least a good cohort of budding entrepreneurs and masters and PhD students. They would actually be possibly folks that are already in workforce development. And I think one big piece missing still that I think we should not exclude is that these centers should also include areas of expertise for grant writing. I don't think that's ever going to go away in our space. And I think I see this duality where either you're focused on experts who can help you write the grant, or you're focused on experts that can help you possibly raise a safe note. But unless you really sort of coach entrepreneurs on how to do both or how to do everything and walk and chew gum at the same time, I think you're doing them a disservice, because entrepreneurs themselves are thinking about their entire capital stack, not just one or two things in isolation. So,
and that's something that venture studios are like, those kind of services. Like, no entrepreneur should do that themselves or in isolation. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely.
And grant writing is a skill, and some people are really good at it and really enjoy it. Not me.
I don't
but
enjoy it.
Definitely, like, if you're good at it, it unlocks so much. And if you're good at fundraising as well, and if you're good at
Exactly.
pitching and etc., like, it's a skill, and it's something, of course, you have to learn as an entrepreneur, but not necessarily grant writing. So it's one of those services that should just be centralized in a hub, and let's go. Because if everybody's doing that themselves, I think a lot of grants actually never get like submissions are in many places very low because it's so tedious. And also then after grants get applied, then the administration piece is also an absolute disaster usually. And reporting, and if that can be slightly centralized, that would be amazing. Speaking for a friend,
I mean, when you think about sort of ag and aquaculture, it's lost time, and it's also similar in some ways to like deep tech in that there's a lot of equipment, and there's a lot of accounting, and there's a lot of post grant administration. There's a lot of things that I think hamper a lot of ideas from getting germinated. But I do think that pushing all those resources into one place also resolves some of the pernicious questions that investors might have, which is like, I can't get any deal flow right now. There's just not enough deal flow for me. And I think unless you sort of start at the sort of the very initial phase, all the follow-on funding, that entire ecosystem will just not happen by its own.
It's almost like a natural ecosystem to be regenerated. Yeah, it needs a full force. And
yes, it does.
And it's fascinating. I don't think anybody ever said I would put it all in venture studios in a cluster. But very fair answer to the $1 billion question. And leading to another, I mean, we take away your fund, but we do give you the magic capabilities and magic wand to change one thing, but only one thing overnight. What would that be? We've had answers on consciousness, on very practical disappearing of subsidies or animals outside, etc. Like, it could be literally anything. What would it be if you had that magic power?
I think the biggest thing that I'm worried about right now is antibiotics. I think it's been in the news a lot. I know it sounds like it is one of those things that kind of keeps me up at night. I think some countries are doing better than others, but I would try to sort of stop or severely limit antibiotic use in agriculture and aquaculture. It just is one of those things that terrifies me, that the artifact of our modern world is based off of antibiotics, and yet we're overusing them to the point where once some sort of that resistance happens in our entire ecosystem, you could literally move yourself back into the Stone Ages or medieval times. And it's just something that I think we sort of like, not all of us, but the overuse of antibiotics is the biggest thing that I would just, if I had a magic wand, I would try to regulate it a lot more than it is now.
Yeah, and just to give a bit of perspective on why it's such an issue, it's been overused also in humans, but definitely in the animal side of things, to basically a regular part of feed, and meaning like anywhere else you get, in this case, super viruses and super bacteria, mostly, of course, not viruses, but like super weeds. Like, if you resist enough, something will figure its way around it. And that means also for us, we don't have the antibiotic suite anymore. We used to have, and actually we're down to very few. Of course, new ones get discovered, but not so often anymore. Which simply means if something jumps from the animal kingdom to our kingdom, which of course is the same, we have a huge issue, because we just don't have any of our weapons left, let's say, to fight. And it's very underestimated, I think, or very underreported how much is used. I don't know the numbers, but do start Googling if you want to, in agriculture regularly. Now, not just something is sick, we need to. No, just dumping it in water, dumping it in the feed, just because it makes animals grow faster. And it's of course a complete misuse of that, and super risky for basically the whole animal kingdom. That's it's also a first one we ever heard somebody say that, but a very, very fair one. And we like to ask this contrarian question, like where are you contrarian in your bubble, which of course is a bit of a specific one in this case. Like I don't know if the sea urchin bubble is necessarily very big, but maybe in the aquaculture space, I don't know what conferences you go to, what groups, let's say, you visit. Where do you within your group, let's say, think very differently? What do you believe to be true that others don't? Definitely inspired by John Kemp's question.
I always think that things are going to happen a lot faster than they are. Honestly, in this case, I think aquaculture is going to, and regenerative at large, is going to happen a lot faster than people think. And, going back to my permaculture days, when we were studying soil health 10, 15 years ago, it was already sort of a holy shit moment for me in the fact that we were stripping all of our topsoils, depleting our aquifers, basically stripping our oceans of wild harvest. These things have follow-on effects that we are seeing more and more. And I think that there's definitely a steamrolling of the effects, the consequences of all of our collective decisions or lack of decisions in a modern industrial area. And I think a lot of these, that's also why I think for me, urchins are a straw man for a model that I think can be used going forward for whatever you want to call it. Regenerative, blue economy, sustainable. There needs to be case studies and models for how we're going to transition from the old way to another way. And so I do like to sort of dive deep into urchins, but I'm also just trying to prove that there is another model that people can glom onto. People right now are looking for different models. Everyone knows, many people know that the current paradigm doesn't work. And so I always believe that the future needs to be manifested faster. And I honestly believe in this case that it will by sheer necessity. So.
Yeah, and it's an interesting entry point you chose with something extremely exclusive, high quality, and great tasting, which I will discover at some point. But like, it's an interesting entry point compared to I don't know, carrots or tilapia or something that definitely is not as sexy or as appealing as a sea urchin. And then it happens to have all these other side effects and happens to be a zombie to a certain extent. And of course, and it's not responsible for the kelp forest disappearing, but definitely helps if we eat more of them and not flown, let's say, from Japan.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain school of thought within sort of modern sort of conservation that you want to protect the wild lands that are left. I think the challenge right now is that the damage that we've done is so large that unless you kind of go back and what I call wisely intervene in certain ecosystems, they're just going to keep deteriorating. And so I think the approach that I urge people to look at is where in the ecosystem you see these impacts happening, and to sort of focus your entrepreneur, your innovative mindset into. And there are many examples across the agriculture, forestries, and aquaculture notions where these effects are obviously manifesting. So,
and if you would be building this and focus so much on sea urchins, what are other places? What other things you might be building or might be focusing on? What are other nodal points or wise interventions, as you mentioned?
I think there's a really good model for harvesting lionfish in Florida, in the Caribbean. They're making this crazy leather. They're making sustainable leather out of lionfish skin. There has been some efforts to ranch.
Why is lionfish an issue? Just for
lionfish,
or lionfish.
Lionfish are these. They're actually beautiful fish. They have these crazy spikes, if you've ever seen them, and they have all these really beautiful scales. And so they were very popular in the aquarium trade because they're just so freaking beautiful. But like anything in the aquarium trade, one day someone decides they don't want it and they leave it and they put it into the ocean thinking nothing bad is going to happen. And then they start proliferating, just like the python in Florida. But you have a lot of these species that either didn't exist in their current native ecosystem, or they've simply proliferated based off of factors that we talked about with urchins. And there needs to be some intervention here because the ecosystems are out of balance. And if you leave the lionfish in Florida, for example, they're going to eat all the native species, and then you're going to have a huge imbalance in terms of all the other fish on the coral reef. And so there have been efforts to basically catch these lionfish. First, people were trying to cook them. The latest iteration of that is that there's actually people that are trying to make sustainable leather out of the lionfish skin, high-end leather. Again, I kind of gravitate towards high-end. I know most of us don't want to be catering to the wealthy, but if you really think about the model that capitalism sort of encourages, you always have to start there in order to scale it down. And that's just a recognition sort of how business models and how some of these markets work. So the lionfish is a great example. Invasive Asian carp that have been also introduced into a lot of the waterways in the U.S. People are attempting to farm those. Those are great ideas. There was invasive blue crabs in Italy last year that the Italians simply didn't know what to do with, and they were grinding them into a pulp and throwing them in landfills. Well, whereas in East Asia, there are people that will eat those crabs as a delicacy. So there's a lot of ecosystem issues if you just stay in tune with what's going on in the news that could be all sorts of viable business models. So
it's interesting, yeah, your natural inclination to go to the higher-end market or the delicacy one, which I think is very fair because there's money there, there's margins, there is a need for stories, there's a need for taste and flavor, there are supply chains in place that can handle delicacy in certain way. I mean, of course, leather is different, but you can fuel and you can make a point. Like there's an easy storytelling point to be made, regardless if you're going to catch a lot of lionfish, but maybe it does take off, and if it does, you're gonna have people hunting for lionfish because of the leather potential. So it's a very, very interesting one. There are a lot of these not niche but potential more than a niche businesses. I think we haven't really captured, and it seems a lot better than running a company that does, I don't know, anger management of smashing sea urchins with hammers, because then you have to pay attention if they're still fully alive and full of seeds that might create more trouble.
Yeah, I think you just have to be clever about it. I mean, I just think that any problem that exists out there with our ecosystem
can be eaten, can be turned into a delicacy.
Yeah, turn into something. I think just kind of looking at something and just unpacking it. I mean, it takes time, but there are certainly a lot of layers to all these stories. And once you peel back the top few layers, you start to understand that there's actually a lot of commonality in the way that you approach a lot of them. There's not necessarily just one-off, cases. There starts to become parallel patterns across a lot of these challenges that I see. Even when I sort of read about a lot of companies that get funded, there are patterns that you start to sort of see pop up over and over again. So
yeah, no, of course, if you're this is ideal for a venture studio focused on how to make invasive species that happen to be a delicacy somewhere else, or maybe in your place, how to do that. I mean, that's that's written all over it, let's say.
Yeah, that's actually the other thing that I would do, Cohen, is instead of doing this, I would start the venture studio. I mean, you start to see the patterns pop up, and there's just a lot of opportunity out there.
And do you see more entrepreneurs entering the space or wanting, like entrepreneurial people, let's say people that have experience elsewhere in running teams, raising maybe money, either for profit, non-profit, but are able to go from 0 to 1 or get stuff done, getting interested. We see that, but of course in our bubble, that we see talent getting into regeneration. Have you seen the same?
I think you see it at the edges. And you definitely see a wellspring of people that want to, because the sheer issues going on are just so large vis-a-vis maybe some of the issues that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis in their day jobs. You see a lot of people that join water coolers like the one that you hold, which are great for mindshare. I think people are trying to convince themselves how to take the leap. I still see fewer people taking it realistically, but I see a lot of people kind of trying to figure out how to dabble. And I don't know how to get the dabblers into sort of firmly within the problem space. There are certain things I think that preclude them from doing it, which is, how do you self-fund a regenerative startup from 0 to 1 when there's just not enough sort of funding available? So I think there are people there's some successive types of people kind of waiting to be unlocked, if you will, as the ecosystem itself kind of de-risks. That's kind of what I would say. But I do think there are some folks moving in, like Dan, that we met, that are trying to sort of push forward and make that ecosystem more amenable to innovators. But I really think in order to get people that are really innovating on the ground, I do think we need to basically figure out how to build more support systems for them. Because unlike in tech, you could basically, go raise $5 million with a PowerPoint. That just doesn't exist in this space. And I think people always compare how hard things are with the spaces that they understand. And you really have to be mission driven to sort of pull yourself into this space, given the fact that it is still inherently more risky than other spaces.
Yeah. I think it's a perfect moment to wrap up as well. And I want to thank you so much for coming on here and share early in the journey, and definitely looking forward to keep track of it and follow, and how, and of course taste at some point, but how sea urchins become from a zombie to of course, again, a delicacy, but actually help restore a lot of the kelp forest, and who knows what other delicacies are a current invasive somewhere and we could eat and can feel good about.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to send you a sample soon.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.